for some opportunities tomorrow. And I have what I like to call a 3-point plan for getting there. I have a business background, and I think they're pretty standard business procedures, things that you would look at in any successful endeavor. One is controlling costs. I think if we look at the costs that have been increasing, we look at healthcare, we look at the cost of fuel, and those are areas that we need to focus on and try and contain those costs as best we can. I think we need to look at things like regionalization to do that. We need to tackle the healthcare issue. We've made a great start on an important project, but we need to continue and make it not only accessible but affordable. There are 2 more points to the plan. I'm sure I won't have enough time to discuss.
I'm sure before this is
we'll
over, we'll
there.
get to that.
The second point is to find all available revenues. I think we have great opportunities here in Metro West for generating additional revenues through economic development. We need to pursue those. And I couldn't agree more with the question with Dan on the question of priorities. I think the question is, there are many important competing priorities at the State House. I think there are no simple solutions to that. I think no one's got the right answer.
Could I respond to that?
Sure. If I could just finish my thought, please. My thought on setting priorities, a tangible objective that we could set would be to do like many other states do, which is to actually develop or require a fiscal impact statement for bills coming through the State House. I think that's something that would allow us to have information that we need to be able to make the difficult decisions about the important priorities that we're all going to have to make decisions on.
Can I respond to that briefly?
Yeah, we're going to keep it brief.
Sure, absolutely. I agree that people don't like people running for office pointing fingers, but frankly, money doesn't spend itself. $1 billion over benchmark in our government last year did not spend itself. People did that, and they did it behind closed doors, and you know what? There ought to be some blame to go around for that situation. I agree, a fiscal impact statement would be fantastic. That would be a quantum leap from what's going on now, which is everything's decided literally behind closed doors. I'd like to get debate back into the floor of the House chamber as a first step so that people can actually see what people are voting on, what people are proposing, who's twisting whose arms.
We can throw our questions out the window because pre-programming, they're hitting on a lot of topics here. You guys, I know you guys are sitting there ready to go. Michelle, go ahead.
Okay, the next question deals with education, which is obviously tied into the economy, and we've already touched on it. According to your websites, you both support adequate funding for education, and in fact, Mr. Haley, you even say it should be our top spending priority. However, as we all know, the districts are strapped for cash. There are increased fees being charged for busing. How are we going to provide the money that's needed for education?
Mr. Haley, you're up first.
Absolutely. Well, that comes right back to what I was saying before. It's the districts are strapped for cash. That's right. The state last year took in more cash in tax revenues than ever before in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, that money is going places other than to local aid. In our last fiscal crisis, lottery funds are supposed to go back to cities and towns to fund education. In the last fiscal crisis, the legislature capped the level of funding that could come back to cities and towns to fund education because they wanted to keep more of that money for the general fund so that they can portion it out as they see fit. Now, the lottery aid, as we recovered from that last fiscal crisis, should have been uncapped, but it wasn't. The legislature refuses to do it because legislators like to have their hands on the money. They don't like to send it back to cities and towns, where cities and towns, in places like the towns in this district, the local officials are accountable to the voters. They do what they do out in the open, and they print up brochures, and they go to town meeting, and they explain themselves. That's how our tax dollars should be spent.
Sure. I'd like to have a follow-up to Mr. Haley's comment about record revenues coming into the state, because I've talked to a couple of people who are very in touch with revenues at the state level, and they don't seem to understand where that number came from. Perhaps a question for another time. I guess, when I look at what's going on in the state, we know we have decreased capital gains tax income simply because we're suffering from the same economic problems that the rest of the country is. And I think we need to recognize that, we've got that issue. We've got state sales taxes are down, lottery revenues are down because of probably both the economy as well as a maturing lottery. So the reality is that we just don't have the revenues that are there. And on the other side, we have the increasing costs of utilities, of energy. So I think you know, we have to focus on real material solutions. And things I talked about before, you know, controlling costs the best we can, generating additional revenues and investing in our economic potential, which we have a lot of here in Metro West, and setting priorities.
Could I follow up on that since I was challenged?
Sure.
Yeah. I don't know who you're talking to. I'm reading the newspaper. Last year, $1.2 billion more than was budgeted for came in. And I guarantee you they budgeted for what they expected to get. And they spent $1 billion more than what was budgeted for. So when you say that revenues aren't there, they are there. And there's no doubt about it, the country's in tough fiscal times, the state's in tough fiscal times. But in terms of the money coming into the state in tax revenue, it's coming in, it's just not coming back here.
So let's get specific here, Dan. You have done some finger pointing and blaming, which is certainly your right, and I enjoy a lot of that, frankly. However, it does begin to sound like a mantra that we've heard before from the person who's simply going to whine about this stuff. Give me a specific. Where would you cut? What programs now are being totally overfunded and are depriving our poor cities and towns of money?
Sure.
Very specific.
Well, look, there's cuts to be made. There's also fundamental reforms to be made to save a whole lot of money. And in some areas they're related. There was just a report last week that we're looking at 13-point-some-odd billion dollars in unfunded pension liability going forward. Meaning, to put it very simply, we've made promises at the state level to pay out billions and billions of dollars for which there is no revenue source.
Okay, that's a specific. How do you solve that problem, though? Do you renege on those promises made?
No, absolutely not. But when someone has made a contract with the state and they've worked through their career and they have a pension due to them, absolutely not. Every time we have a contested election, people on both sides of the aisle talk about the need to enact pension reform. And a fundamental tenet of that is to say, going forward, for workers coming into state government, to say, you will pay 25% of your health care, just as the private sector pays. Your pension levels will be in keeping with what the state can project to afford going forward. And once people get into office, and they start having people come into their office and yell at them about how you cannot touch pensions, that all of a sudden goes away. And so that unfunded liability continues to compound. And in fact, this year, the legislature voted to push out the period of time to pay that back, which in order to borrow against it short term. And that, of course, makes it more expensive going forward, as anyone who knows, who's ever borrowed money knows.
Follow? Response to the same. She would like to respond first, and then we'll come in. Okay. Go ahead.
I guess my point there is that the question was what programs are overfunded such that we can take that money and move it into other priorities like education. And I think what I've heard from you is, in fact, we have additional obligations that we require funds for, not additional sources of revenue that we can use to fund programs.
I need to, of course, respond to that. That's an interesting read of what I said, but of course, there's plenty of things that at the state level that hemorrhage money. Everyone in Metro West is familiar with the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority, which literally hemorrhages money. It's the most inefficient organization you could possibly have, and the legislature refuses to fundamentally reform it, or even to fundamentally analyze its operations, because too many people, frankly, are related to legislators who work for the Turnpike Authority. But you've got money bleeding out of that agency, and this week, as a board member, last week as a board member resigned because the financial situation is so bad. Well, what did the administration do? They said, we're going to transfer money from Mass Highway to the Pike to bail it out, essentially. So you're taking taxpayer dollars from essentially an intact vessel and pouring them into a leaking vessel.